The wind moaned through the skeletal remains of the cabin, a sound Elias Ward hadn't heard in 5 years. He'd come for the old water pump, nothing more, but the sight of the collapsed roof was a punch to the gut. This was the place. The one patch of earth he had sworn never to set foot on again, where the ghosts of his wife Eleanor and his infant son Samuel whispered on every gust of wind that scoured the sun-baked earth. He had built a new life, a smaller one on the far side of the valley, a life of deliberate, crushing silence. But the pump at his new ranch had seized, and this was the only spare part for miles. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle creaking in protest. The air was thick with the scent of dry rot and regret. The door, ripped from one hinge, banged a lonely rhythm against the warped frame. He walked closer, his boots stirring up ghosts of dust, planning only to secure the door to stop the noise, to quiet one more wailing specter. But as he pushed it open, a different scent hit him, overriding the decay. It was the smell of sickness and dried blood, a metallic tang that was horribly, viscerally alive. In the far corner of the single-room shack, shrouded in shadows, a figure was slumped against the wall. An Apache woman. Her eyes were wide black as obsidian chips, but they held a glazed, lifeless quality that suggested she was already halfway to the other side. Her thin legs were bound with a frayed rope, the skin around her ankles rubbed raw and bloody. Bruised wounds along her shins had begun to fester in the oppressive heat. On the floor in front of her sat a clay bowl bone, dry, a testament to how long she had been left here to die. Elias stood frozen, his hand still on the splintered door. His first instinct, honed by years of solitude and the hard-bitten realities of the territory, was to turn and walk away. This was not his fight. He had enough ghosts of his own. But then the woman wheezed, a faint, ragged sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone. Her hand curled into a tight fist, gripped a small, dark object. When his shadow fell across her, her head turned with an agonizing slowness. Her eyes, pools of ash and despair, focused on him, filled with a primal fear that was quickly being consumed by resignation. Elias's voice, when it came, was a rusty croak. "Do you still want to live?" There was no reply, only a slow, deliberate blink that seemed to take all her remaining strength. It was enough. He drew the worn hunting knife from his belt, its blade glinting in the sliver of light from the doorway. He knelt and sawed through the rope. The fibers parted with a dusty sigh. He then lifted her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light, like a bundle of dry branches, yet the lean, hard muscle beneath her tattered clothes spoke of a life that had been anything but frail. She had been a warrior. As he shifted her weight, her fist loosened slightly. The object she clutched fell into her lap. Elias's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just a piece of leather. It was a small, intricately tooled pouch, faded and worn, but the pattern was unmistakable. A rising sun over a trio of mesas. Eleanor had designed it herself. It was from her saddle, the one she was riding the day the fever took her. He thought it had been lost, burned with her other belongings to stop the plague spread. The sight of it here in the hands of a dying Apache woman, in the very place his world had ended, was a cold shock that jolted him more than any gunshot could. The past was not dead. It wasn't even past. It was here, breathing its foul breath in his face. "Let's go." Elias said, his voice now a low growl, masking the tremor of confusion and grief that shook him. He placed her carefully on his saddle, her head lolling against the horn. "If you die out here, no one will ever know." He didn't know if he was talking to her or to himself. He spurred the horse toward his ranch, away from the ruins and the ghosts. Behind them, the old shack leaned in the oppressive silence, a mute witness to a tragedy that was far from over. They reached the new ranch as the sun bled crimson over the distant mesas. Elias dismounted and carried the woman into his cabin. The room was sparse and functional, built for one man's survival, not for comfort. A narrow bed, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. Soft evening light poured through the cracks in the door, casting their long, distorted shadows across the plank floor. He laid her gently on the bed and pulled a thick wool blanket up to her chest. She did not resist, but her hand had found the leather pouch again, her knuckles turning white as she clutched it. Elias worked with a grim efficiency born of habit. He lit the fire in the hearth, its flames chasing the shadows into the corners. He poured a handful of cornmeal into a pot of boiling water, and soon the faint, earthy scent of thin porridge filled the small space. He placed the bowl on the table, pulled out a chair, and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his head like a shroud. He said nothing, just watched the fire, the silence in the cabin, a heavy breathing thing. After a long while, she managed to sit up, her arms trembling with the effort. Her dark eyes, filled with an animal wariness, tracked his every move. She was a wounded wolf, uncertain if he was a threat or a savior. With a deep, shuddering breath, she reached for the bowl and drank in slow, painful sips, her gaze never leaving him. "You are not going to die," Elias said quietly, his back still to her. "At least not tonight." She did not answer. She set the bowl down the clay, making a soft clink against the wood, and hugged the leather pouch to her chest as if it were a shield. When the sun had fully set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black, Elias brought over a bucket of warm water and placed it on the floor beside the bed. "Wash up," he said, his voice flat, gesturing to a clean cloth draped over the bucket's rim. She hesitated, her eyes flicking from his face to the water. Then, with a quiet resolve, she bent forward and began to wipe the grime and dried blood from her face and arms. As the layers of dirt came away, they revealed sharp, proud features, high cheekbones, and a firm jaw. Her eyes, cleared of the dust of the trail, were hard and intelligent. This was no weak soul. This was a warrior who had been betrayed. Night fell completely. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, a lonely, mournful sound. An owl called from the cottonwoods down by the creek. Elias stretched out on the long bench near the fire, his Colt within arm's reach, a precaution that was as much a part of him as breathing. In the deep dark, he heard her shifting on the bed. She did not sleep. He could see her silhouette against the faint moonlight, filtering through the window, her head leaned against the wall, her gaze fixed on the yard outside. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her body tense, a bowstring pulled taut, ready to bolt, even though her legs could not carry her. Elias opened his eyes, the firelight casting a faint glow on her rigid form. "No one is coming for your life here," he said, his voice a low rasp, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. Silence. Only the wind answered. Around midnight, a dry, rattling cough broke the quiet. Elias sat up instantly. He poured a cup of water from the canteen and handed it to her. Her fingers brushed his as she took the cup, and for the first time she spoke. A single word whispered so faintly it was barely audible above the wind. Takina. It was her name, not thank you. Her name, an offering, a statement of existence. Elias nodded slowly, returning to his bench. That night, the cabin held 2 distinct rhythms of breath, one deep and steady, the other shallow and ragged. But together, they felt like a fragile bulwark against the vast, indifferent darkness, a fire that refused to go out. The next morning, the town's foreman, Ward Foreman, paid a visit. Elias saw the dust from his buggy from a mile off. Foreman was a man who carried himself with an air of practiced reason, his face a mask of civic concern. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a politician's easy smile that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Elias," he called out, reining in his horse near the fence. "Morning to you. Just doing my rounds. Wanted to check on you out here. Heard your pump went out." "It did," Elias said, not moving from the porch step where he was mending a piece of tack. "I'm managing." Foreman's gaze swept over the ranch, lingering for a moment on the cabin door. "Good, good. You know we've had some trouble. Couple of head of cattle vanished from the Miller place last week, down by the creek. Tracks looked Apache." He paused, letting the information settle. "Just want to make sure everyone's vigilant. An Apache presence this close to town, it makes folks nervous." Elias's jaw tightened. "I'll keep an eye out." "I know you will." Foreman said, his smile widening a fraction. He had a strange intensity about him, an almost obsessive interest in Elias's affairs that went beyond a foreman's duty. He would ask about Elias's late wife, about the old homestead, his questions always cloaked in sympathy, but feeling more like probing for weaknesses. "You take care of yourself, Elias. A man alone has to be twice as careful." Foreman tipped his hat and turned his buggy around, leaving a trail of dust and unease in his wake. Elias watched him go, a knot of suspicion tightening in his gut. Foreman's concern felt as hollow as a dried gourd. Inside, Takina had heard everything. When Elias entered the cabin, he found her sitting up, her dark eyes sharp with a new kind of alertness. The fear was gone, replaced by something harder. She knew that danger didn't always ride in shouting and shooting. Sometimes it came with a smile and a warning. 3 days later, Foreman returned, and this time he was not alone. Flanked by 2 members of the town council, stout men with self-important expressions, he rode into Elias's yard as if he owned it. Takina was on the porch, her hands busy mending one of Elias's shirts, her movements slow but deliberate. She had regained some of her strength, the hollows in her cheeks beginning to fill out. "Ward." Foreman began dismounting without waiting for an invitation. His tone was no longer neighborly. It was official. "We need to have a word." Elias stepped out of the barn, his face a stony mask. "You're on my land, Foreman. And you're harboring an Apache, which is against town law." Foreman retorted, gesturing curtly at Takina. "The council has voted. She has to go. Folks are spooked. Another 3 head of cattle were stolen last night, and the tracks lead right back toward the borderlands. They're blaming her. They think she's a scout." Elias's gaze was glacial. "She hasn't left this ranch. She can't walk." "None of that doesn't matter." One of the councilmen, a portly shopkeeper named Miller, chimed in. "Her presence is an invitation for the rest of her kind. For the good of the town, Elias, you have to send her away." Takina watched them, her face impassive, but her hands had stilled, her knuckles white around the needle and thread. Elias took a step forward, placing himself between them and the porch. "No." The word hung in the air, simple and absolute. Foreman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. "Don't be a fool, Elias. This isn't a request. It's the law. We are giving you 24 hours to comply. After that, we'll enforce it." He turned back to his horse, his movements stiff with anger. "You're making a powerful enemy today, Ward. I hope for your sake it's worth it." They rode away, leaving the threat to fester in the quiet afternoon air. The inciting incident had passed. Elias had drawn his line in the sand. He looked back at Takina. Her expression was unreadable, but in the depths of her dark eyes, he saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen before, a shared defiance. He had chosen to stand with her, and in doing so, he had set himself against the entire town. The silence on his ranch was no longer just lonely. It was now the charged quiet before a storm. The following days were a blur of tense preparation. Elias and Takina worked with a silent, synchronized purpose, their unspoken partnership solidifying with every nail hammered and every plan made. He reinforced the cabin door with an iron strap and boarded up the back window, leaving only small slits for a rifle barrel. He spent an afternoon clearing brush away from the house, creating a wide open space where no one could approach unseen. Takina, despite her inability to walk, was a tireless partner. From her makeshift wheelchair, a sturdy chair Elias had mounted on old wagon wheels, she sharpened tools, measured lengths of wood, and kept a vigilant watch over the valley. A bond of trust forged in shared adversity was growing between them. The long silences were no longer empty, but filled with a comfortable understanding. One afternoon, as they worked, Takina finally spoke of her past. Her voice was low and steady, devoid of self-pity. "My tribe, they follow the old ways." She said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "When a warrior can no longer hunt or fight, they become a burden. When the dry season came and the herds moved south, that there was not enough water, not enough food, they left me." She paused, turning the leather pouch over in her hands. "They said I should find my own way to die. It is the honorable path." "There's no honor in abandoning your own." Elias said, his voice rough. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "Honor is decided by those who survive." Their first test came 3 nights later. The moon was a sliver in a starless sky. Elias was dozing on the bench, the Winchester across his lap, when Takina's sharp hiss cut through the darkness. "Fire!" He was on his feet in an instant. Through the rifle slit, he could see it, a lick of orange flame crawling up the dry wall of the barn. Outside, the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. It wasn't a full-blown attack, just a warning, a coward's way of showing force. "The water barrels," he yelled, grabbing 2 buckets. Takina was already moving, wheeling her chair toward the door with surprising speed. "The well!" she cried out. "The rope is shorter." They worked as a team, a frantic, desperate dance against the growing flames. Elias filled the buckets at the well, his muscles straining as he hauled them hand over hand and ran them to the barn. Takina, positioned near the water trough, used a smaller pail to douse the embers that drifted toward the cabin, her powerful arms slinging water with grim accuracy. Smoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. The fire crackled and roared, a hungry beast trying to devour their world. They fought it for what felt like an eternity, their faces blackened with soot and their lungs burning. Finally, with one last desperate heave, Elias emptied a bucket over the highest point of the flames, and the fire sputtered, hissed, and died, leaving behind a smoldering blackened scar on the barn wall. They collapsed in the dirt chests, heaving side by side. The immediate danger was over. In the quiet that followed, Elias looked at Takina. Her face was streaked with ash, her hair singed at the tips, but her eyes shone with a fierce, unyielding light. They had faced the first assault together and won. Their partnership was no longer just a matter of circumstance. It had been forged in fire. She was not a burden. She was a fighter. And in that moment, Elias knew he would protect her life as if it were his own. The fire hardened Elias's resolve. This was no longer just about protecting a stranger. It was about defending his home from men who used fear and lies as weapons. The cattle thefts felt wrong, too convenient. Apaches, in his experience, were efficient. They took what they needed and vanished. They didn't steal a few head at a time, leaving obvious tracks that led toward the borderlands, like a signed confession. It was sloppy, theatrically sloppy. The next morning before dawn, he saddled his horse. "I'm going riding," he told Takina. "Keep the rifle close." She simply nodded her hand, already resting on the stock of the Winchester he'd left for her by the door. Elias didn't ride toward the border. He rode toward the creek near Miller's property where the last theft had occurred. He spent hours tracing the tracks, his years of experience reading the land like a book. The hoof prints were indeed from unshod ponies, but something was off. The gait was wrong, too heavy in places, as if the horses were being led, not ridden, with the fluid grace of Apache warriors. And beneath the pony prints, almost entirely obscured, he found what he was looking for, the faint telltale crescent of a shod horse. One of Foreman's men, leading a few captured mustangs to create a false trail. Further down the creek, hidden in a thicket of willows, he found the proof he needed. A slaughtered calf, its hide bearing Miller's brand, had been hastily buried. But the butchering was clumsy, wasteful, and nearby, half trodden into the mud, was a discarded cheroot, the brand still visible on its paper ring. Foreman's preferred smoke. It wasn't Apache's. It was Foreman's men stealing cattle to stoke the town's fear and turn them against him. Elias rode into town that afternoon, his face a thundercloud. He found Foreman holding court outside the general store, charming a small crowd with talk of security and order. Elias dismounted and strode toward him, holding up the cheroot. "You dropped this, Foreman." Foreman's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Ward." Down by the creek, Elias set his voice low and dangerous. "Next to Miller's dead calf, the one your boys butchered after they ran off the others with a few unshod ponies." A murmur went through the small crowd. Foreman's expression tightened. "Now, Elias, we're all neighbors here. No need for wild accusations. You've been under a lot of strain. Perhaps your mind is playing tricks on you." "My mind is clear," Elias bit back. "You're manufacturing a threat to run me off my land. You're using that woman as an excuse." Foreman let out a sigh, a performance of pure patience and reason for the benefit of the onlookers. "Friends," he said, turning to the townsfolk. "You see what I mean? The man is overwrought. He's choosing an Apache vagrant over his own community. He's seeing conspiracies where there are only simple facts. He's becoming a danger to himself and to all of us." The confrontation was a disaster. Foreman, with his sly, manipulative wit, twisted Elias's righteous anger into the ravings of an unhinged hermit. The crowd, already primed by fear, looked at Elias not with sympathy, but with suspicion. He had played right into Foreman's hands. Defeated and seething, Elias mounted his horse and rode out of town, the gazes of his former neighbors feeling like daggers in his back. He returned to the ranch under a sky bruised with the colors of sunset. Takina was on the porch waiting. She had seen the storm on his face the moment he rode into view. He slumped into a chair beside her, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He told her everything. The tracks, the calf, the cheroot, the public humiliation. She listened in silence, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, the silence, stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets. "You believe me," he stated. It wasn't a question. "I have seen men like him," Takina said softly. "They use the words of others to build their own strength. They turn fear into a weapon." She reached out her calloused fingers, gently touching the back of his hand. It was a simple, fleeting gesture, but it sent a current of warmth through him, cutting through the cold fury. "You are not alone in this fight, Elias." Her touch lingered. He turned his hand over his fingers, intertwining with hers. In the fading light, he saw not a victim, not an outcast, but a woman of incredible strength and quiet dignity. The escalating danger, the shared struggle, had stripped away the barriers between them, revealing a deep and powerful connection. Leaning in, he closed the small distance between them, and their lips met in a kiss that was not about passion, but about solace and a promise. A promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The kiss had changed everything. The simmering tension between them had broken, replaced by a profound and quiet intimacy. But the world outside their small sanctuary was growing more hostile by the day. Foreman's poison had worked. Elias was no longer just an eccentric widower. He was a traitor, an Apache lover, a threat to the town's safety. But why? The land was good, but not so good that a man like Foreman would orchestrate such an elaborate and risky scheme just for a few more acres. There was something else at play, a deeper, more personal obsession driving him. Elias had to know what it was. His chance came 2 nights later under the cover of a new moon. He knew Foreman often worked late in his office at the town hall, a small clapboard building that housed the settlement's records. It was a reckless gamble, but it was the only one he had left. "This is foolish," Takina said as he checked the loads in his Colt. Her voice was laced with concern, not accusation. "It's more foolish to fight an enemy you don't understand," he replied, tucking the pistol into his belt. He looked at her, the soft lamplight catching the worry in her eyes. "Bolt the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." She nodded her hand, gripping the arm of her wheelchair. "Ride with the wind at your back, Elias." The ride to town was a nerve-wracking journey through shadows and silence. He tethered his horse in a copse of trees at the edge of town and slipped through the back alleys like a ghost. The town hall was dark, save for a single lamp burning in Foreman's office. Peering through the window, Elias saw the room was empty. Foreman had gone home. He jimmied the lock with his knife, the soft click of the tumblers sounding like a gunshot in the dead quiet. Inside, the office smelled of stale cigar smoke and leather. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk, ledgers and deeds bound in twine. He searched quickly, his eyes scanning for anything related to his land, any correspondence that might reveal Foreman's true partners or plans. He found nothing. Frustrated, he was about to leave, when his gaze fell upon a small, framed photograph on the corner of the desk, turned slightly away from the door. He picked it up. The glass was dusty, the image faded by the sun. It depicted a family stiffly posed as they were in those days. A man, a woman, and a small boy. The man was a younger, thinner version of Ward Foreman, his face not yet hardened by whatever bitterness now consumed him. The boy was a carbon copy of his father, but it was the woman who made Elias's blood run cold. He recognized her instantly. Her face was etched into his memory, a permanent fixture in the worst day of his life. She had kind, tired eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. It was Martha, the midwife from the next county over. The woman who had been there when Eleanor had gone into a difficult, harrowing labor. The woman who had delivered his son Samuel into the world, only to watch him and his mother slip away in the plague-ridden weeks that followed. The pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Foreman's wife was the midwife. Foreman wasn't just Foreman. He was Martha's husband. His obsession with Elias, with his land, the old homestead where it had all happened, was not about cattle or laws or property. It was deeply, terrifyingly personal. A cold dread washed over Elias. He had been fighting a land grab, but he was actually in the middle of a vendetta. He placed the photograph back on the desk, his movements precise, his mind reeling. He now understood the chilling depth of the Foreman's hatred. Foreman didn't just want his land. He wanted to ruin him, to strip away everything he had, piece by agonizing piece, as payback for a tragedy that had shattered both their lives. Slipping out of the office and back into the night, Elias felt a new kind of fear. He wasn't just fighting for his home anymore. He was fighting a ghost from his own past, a ghost with a name, a face, and a powerful, all-consuming need for revenge. The discovery in Foreman's office shifted the conflict from a tense standoff to a siege. Foreman, perhaps sensing that Elias now knew the truth, dropped all pretense of civility. His retaliation was swift and suffocating. He used his power as the head of the town council to turn the screws, isolating the ranch completely. The next time Elias rode to the general store for supplies, the proprietor, Mr. Miller, refused to serve him. "I can't, Elias." He'd set his eyes full of fear and apology. "Foreman's orders. He said anyone who trades with you will have their business license reviewed by the council. I've got a family to feed." It was the same everywhere. The blacksmith wouldn't shoe his horse. The feed store was suddenly out of grain. Elias was an island cut off from the mainland of the community by a sea of fear orchestrated by one man. Worse, Foreman posted armed guards on the main road leading to the ranch. Two grim-faced men he'd hired from out of town, their holsters worn low on their hips, sat on a bluff overlooking the valley. They didn't try to stop Elias, but their presence was a constant, unnerving message: you are being watched. You are trapped. The ranch, once a sanctuary, began to feel like a prison. Their supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. Flour, coffee, salt, and most importantly, ammunition. Every sunrise brought a new gnawing anxiety. Elias took to hunting for their food, but the rifle shots echoed across the valley, each one a stark announcement of their diminishing resources. Takina watched the strain etch new lines onto Elias's face. She saw the way he rationed the cornmeal, the way he counted the remaining rifle cartridges each night. She saw his quiet despair and met it with a fierce, unwavering calm. She began setting snares for rabbits and squirrels, her knowledge of the land, providing for them in ways he hadn't considered. She showed him which wild roots were edible and which herbs could be brewed into a bitter, fortifying tea. She worked tirelessly, her resilience a silent rebuke to Foreman's siege. Their romantic connection deepened into a powerful, unspoken partnership for survival. They were two solitary souls backed into a corner, finding strength not just in themselves, but in each other. They spoke little of the future, for the future was a menacing, formless cloud on the horizon. Instead, they focused on the present, on reinforcing the fence, on rationing the water, on the shared warmth of the fire in the long, dark nights. Elias watched her one evening as she skillfully skinned a rabbit, her hands sure and steady. He felt a wave of protectiveness so fierce it almost stole his breath. Foreman's vendetta was aimed at him, at the ghost of his family's past. But Takina was caught in the crossfire. She had been abandoned by her people only to be trapped in a white man's war of grief. "And this is my fight," he said, his voice thick with guilt. "You should not have to pay for it." Takina looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "When your enemy is my enemy, it is our fight," she said simply. "You did not leave me to die in that shack. I will not leave you to die here." The lines were drawn. Outside, Foreman was gathering men, his whispers of an Apache threat and a dangerous renegade, attracting rough, rootless men looking for coin and a fight. The air grew heavy, pregnant with the promise of violence. Elias and Takina were running out of food, out of ammunition, and out of time. The final assault was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. The day began with an omen. The sky, usually a brilliant, cloudless blue, was a sickly, jaundiced yellow. A low, persistent hum vibrated in the air, a sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. By noon, the wind began to howl, picking up from the south, carrying with it a fine, gritty dust that stung the eyes and coated the tongue. A storm was coming, a proper duster, one of the malevolent squalls that could strip the paint from a house and scour the world into a single blinding shade of ochre. "They'll use the storm as cover," Elias said grimly, securing the last shutter on the cabin. "The wind is a warrior's ally." Takina replied, her voice calm amidst the rising gale. She sat in her wheelchair by the door, a freshly loaded Winchester across her lap, a brace of sharpened skinning knives tucked into her belt. It hides the hunter, but it also deafens him. As the afternoon wore on, the world outside dissolved. The sun vanished behind a thick, churning wall of red sand. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof and rattling the very foundations of the cabin. It was a chaotic, disorienting world of pure sound and fury. And then, through the roar of the storm, came another sound, the thunder of hoofbeats, muffled but unmistakable. They were here. The attack was a nightmare of confusion. Figures on horseback emerged from the swirling dust like specters, their forms blurred and distorted. Gunshots were whip cracks lost in the gale. Elias fired from the front window, aiming at muzzle flashes, fleeting shadows, anything that moved. He fought by instinct, the years of solitude and self-reliance honed to a razor's edge. Takina was a rock of calm in the chaos. Positioned by the door, she fired with methodical precision, her shots less frequent but more deliberate than Elias's. When a rider got too close, trying to use the porch for cover, she didn't hesitate. A knife left her hand in a silver blur, thudding into the man's thigh and sending him screaming back into the maelstrom. The battle raged, a terrifying ballet of flashing lights and muffled sounds in the choking red gloom. A bullet splintered the window frame inches from Elias's head. He ducked, rolling across the floor and coming up by the hearth, firing 2 quick shots that sent another shadow reeling. Then, as suddenly as it began, there was a lull. The wind still howled, but the gunfire ceased. A voice amplified by the strange acoustics of the storm cut through the noise. "Ward, enough of this, face me." It was Foreman. Elias peered through the rifle slit. He could just make out a hulking shape near the barn, Foreman himself using the corner for cover. "You wanted this land, Foreman," Elias roared back. "Come and take it." The land. Foreman's laugh was a raw, broken sound snatched away by the wind. "You think this was ever about the land. This is about payment. This is for Martha." Elias froze. He had known, but hearing the name spoken aloud, hurled as an accusation through the storm, was a gut punch. "My wife was a good woman." Foreman screamed, his voice cracking with a grief that was years old, but still raw. "She answered your call, traveled for 2 days to help your arrogant wife with a difficult birth. She worked herself to the bone in that cursed shack, tending to your wife, to your sickly whelp. And when it was over, when they were both dead, your family gave her a few dollars and sent her on her way. They treated her like a servant." The wind howled a Greek chorus to his tragedy. "She came home exhausted with a fever she caught in your filthy house. She died a month later, worn out and hollowed out by you, by your family's demands. You ruined me, Ward. You took everything from me, this ranch, this life. It's the debt you owe." In that moment, Takina, who had been listening intently, let out a sharp gasp. Her eyes widened, not in fear, but in sudden, shocking recognition. She wheeled herself closer to the door, her gaze fixed on the storm, on the ghost of the man screaming outside. "The midwife," she whispered, her voice trembling. She held up the tooled leather pouch, the relic that had started it all. It was her, Foreman's wife. "She gave this to me." Elias stared at her, uncomprehending. "My tribe had left me." Takina said, her words coming in a rush. "I was crawling toward the road, when her buggy found me. She gave me water. She tended my wounds. She told me her husband, that he was becoming a man filled with hate, obsessed with the Ward family. She gave me this pouch and told me to find my way to your new ranch. She said, Elias Ward is a good man, despite what my husband believes. He will help you. She tried to help me before her own people cast her out. The secondary twist landed with devastating, tragic irony. Foreman's wife, the woman at the heart of his vengeful obsession, had seen the good in Elias. In her final days, she had tried to perform one last act of kindness, an act that had inadvertently brought the two men she was tied to into this final, deadly confrontation. Foreman was fighting to avenge a woman whose final wish was in direct opposition to his bloody crusade. The dust storm raged, but the truth that had just been unleashed was a far more powerful and destructive force. The revelation hung in the air, more potent than the swirling dust. Foreman's righteous fury, built on a foundation of grief, had been fractured by a truth he could never have imagined. Elias saw his opportunity. "Did you hear that, Foreman?" He yelled, his voice carrying over the wind. "Your wife sent her to me. She knew I wasn't the monster you made me out to be. This whole damn thing, your revenge, it's a lie." A choked, strangled cry was Foreman's only answer. In that moment of hesitation, Elias burst from the cabin, firing not at Foreman, but at the ground near his feet. The shots kicked up plumes of sand, disorienting him. One of Foreman's hired guns, recovering from the shock, raised his rifle. But a single clean shot from Takina's Winchester cracked through the air, and the man's weapon clattered to the ground as he clutched a shattered wrist. The fight had gone out of Foreman. He stood exposed, the wind whipping at his coat, a man whose entire world had just been dismantled. He stared at Elias, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred, confusion, and utter despair. He raised his pistol, his hand trembling, but he didn't fire. The weapon seemed too heavy for him to hold. Elias closed the distance, his own pistol steady. "It's over." Foreman's shoulders slumped. He let the gun fall from his fingers, where it was immediately swallowed by the shifting sand. The remaining hired guns, seeing their leader defeated and their cause revealed as a madman's personal vendetta, wasted no time. They mounted their horses and vanished back into the red curtain of the storm. As if on cue, the wind began to lose its fury. The deafening shriek softened to a mournful sigh. The thick blanket of dust started to settle, and the world slowly began to reappear, coated in a fine layer of red grit. The storm, like the battle, was over. Foreman stood amidst the settling dust, a broken man. When the town sheriff and a small posse, alerted by the sounds of the prolonged gunfight, finally arrived, they found Foreman sitting on the ground, weeping openly. He confessed everything: the cattle thefts, the intimidation, the personal vendetta born of grief and twisted by years of resentment. The story spread through the town like wildfire. The townsfolk, who had so easily been manipulated by Foreman's lies, were forced to confront their own fear and prejudice. The narrative of the dangerous renegade and the Apache scout dissolved, replaced by a more complex and tragic tale of two widowers consumed by the same loss. Public opinion, once a weapon against Elias, now shifted to a quiet, shamefaced sympathy. A few days later, the sheriff rode out to the ranch, accompanied by Mr. Miller from the general store. They stopped at the gate, their hats in their hands. "Elias." The sheriff began, his voice heavy with contrition. "The town, we were wrong. We let Foreman's hate blind us. We'd like to offer a truce, and our help rebuilding what was damaged." Miller stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Your credit is good at my store again, Elias. Anything you need, on the house." Elias looked from their faces to Takina, who sat on the porch watching the exchange with her usual quiet dignity. He gave a slow, tired nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. The dust had settled, and in the clear, clean air, there was the fragile possibility of peace. Weeks passed. The fragile peace began to take root and grow. With the help of a few repentant townsfolk, the barn was repaired, its new wood a pale scar against the old, weathered timbers. The rhythms of life on the ranch returned, but they were different now. The silence was no longer heavy with loneliness, but filled with the comfortable presence of two people rebuilding a life from the ashes of their pasts. Elias and Takina worked side by side, their movements an easy, familiar dance. He learned the quiet strength in her resilience. She learned the deep well of kindness beneath his gruff exterior. They were two halves of a whole. They never knew they were missing their bond, forged not in the gentle light of courtship, but in the crucible of fire, siege, and storm. One crisp autumn morning, when the air was sharp, and the leaves on the cottonwoods by the creek had turned a brilliant gold, Elias knew it was time. He found the small tooled leather pouch, the object that had started everything, that had connected all their broken stories, sitting on the mantelpiece. He picked it up, its worn leather soft in his calloused hand. He found Takina by the corral, stroking the neck of his horse. He didn't need to say a word. She saw the pouch in his hand, saw the look in his eyes, and simply nodded. Together they walked, he striding, she wheeling her chair over the familiar packed earth to the far side of the property, to a small quiet rise overlooking the valley. Two simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered by 5 years of sun and wind. Eleanor Ward, Samuel Ward. Elias knelt the ghosts of this place, no longer screaming accusations, but whispering memories. He looked at the names, at the silent ground that held his first life, his first love. For years this place had been a monument to his guilt and grief, a wound that would not heal. Now, looking at it with Takina by his side, it felt different. It felt like history. He held the leather pouch, this symbol of his wife's lost kindness, of Foreman's tragic connection, of Takina's impossible journey to his door. It represented all the pain, all the misunderstanding, all the violence. But it also represented the strange, unforeseen thread of grace that had woven their lives together. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole at the foot of the two graves. He placed the pouch inside a final, meaningful offering. As he covered it with earth, he wasn't burying the past. He was making peace with it, letting its restless spirit finally sleep. He was no longer the haunted man who had ridden to the ruins of his old life. He had learned from the pain, and he was ready to embrace a future. He stood up and took Takina's hand. Her grasp was warm and strong. Together, they turned away from the graves and looked out at the vast, open expanse of their ranch and their home. The sun was rising, bathing the world in a clean, hopeful light.